So, hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Confidence Conversations podcast. I had to remember what I was saying and where I was then for a second. My guest on this episode is somebody I've known for many a year. It's the fabulous Jacqui Jagger. I'm so excited you're here.
Honestly cannot wait for this.
So primarily I've asked Jacqui to come on because I want to have a conversation about the inner critic, one of my favourite topics, and Jacqui knows her stuff too about the inner critic. So who knows where this conversation is going to go. But before we do that, Jacqui, just introduce yourself to our watchers and our listeners and tell them who you are and where you're from. Like blind date.
Yeah. I never would have made it onto Blind Date, so I get quite excited having that opportunity. So, yes, I am Jacqui Jagger, and I am a leadership and career coach. I'm based in the Midlands, and in terms of my kind of specialist subject when it comes to coaching, I work a lot with leaders who are going into a new role. So, kind of first few months, finding their feet, getting to understand what the expectations are, how they can show up as the leader that they want to be within that role. So, as you can imagine, confidence is a big topic for a lot of my clients.
Yeah, and I love that you just described it as my specialist subject is that you know that I'm going to borrow that, don't you? That's you. That will be coming to a networking pitch near you at some point. My specialist subject is brilliant. So we go right. How long have we actually known each other here? Oh, I
12,
want to.
13 years?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So we worked together very closely on a bra fitting project. Amongst other things, but that's the one that that stands out, for want of a better phrase. And yeah, and I loved working with you because I learned so much from you in that space. And you were quite different to me, right? You had quite a different style, and I mean that in a complimentary way. And I love that because that's where I learn, right? I learn from people that are different from me. I was gutted when you left because I was like, oh, I've kind of found a bit of a person that I really admire here. What do I do now? And then you went into coaching, and then I went into coaching. I was like, well, we talk about a lot of the same things, so it made sense that you came on the podcast. So there you go,
Yeah.
little nice Google review there for you. Not an ad,
Oh,
by
love
the way.
it. Thank you.
So let's start how we always start with most podcast guests. Tell me what confidence means to you.
So I love this question. And for me, this answer has layers. So one of the things that I often do with clients is distinguish between confidence, which I describe as being hard won and easily lost. It's situational, it's contextual to the circumstances, to all of your previous life experiences, and your expectation of success, whatever success might mean in that given specific circumstance. But at the deeper level, and this is where often we find that for a lot of clients, this is where the work comes. For me, there is the self-belief level, and this is that foundational underpinning level. And the way that I describe this to clients is this is about your ability to trust yourself to be okay, no matter what the outcome.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the kind of layers for me that I talk to clients about with it.
And it's so true, and I love this. Hard won and easily lost piece around confidence because it's so situational. I often describe it as like it's a bit of a roller coaster. You know, you've got that euphoria of being at the top of it, and then when something hits and you suddenly go down, I mean, that's the bit in the pit of your stomach that makes your stomach churn, doesn't it? And the self-belief, I mean, the definition of confidence itself is to trust yourself no matter what the outcome. So this self-trust, and again, that's multi-layered for me in a sense of everything that's wrapped up in that, which it will include your inner critic and how you talk to yourself, the language you use, having self-compassion, having courage to go off and do stuff so you can be confident. And I think this is the thing when I say flippantly almost, oh, I'm a confidence coach. There's so much wrapped up in that umbrella that it's really hard to describe what we do, because you'll know as well as I do when you work with coaching clients that one client, you might be talking actually about that self-belief in its truest form, but with another client, it might be about having a difficult conversation, but that still requires confidence and a bit of courage and a bit of self-belief.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things for me is that confidence kind of feels quite intangible, and it feels quite self-indulgent almost. Like, you know, to work with a coach and kind of feel like, oh, I want to improve my confidence, people are almost embarrassed to say that that's the thing. And I will often say as well, actually, it's not, you can't work on your confidence, you can work on your courage, you can work on the skills that will underpin allowing you to have a greater expectation of success. So you can't directly work on confidence, but when you, and I think, you know, your watchers and listeners will recognize, when you feel good, when you feel at your best, your whole demeanor changes, how you show up changes, people experience you differently when you do have that confidence. And so, yeah, for me, it is so important for people to understand their own relationship with their confidence, with their self-belief, with how they show up, because it's kind of like, it's Barocca, isn't it? It's you on a really good day when you've got confidence.
When you just think about that and think about what we've just said around, it feels quite self-indulgent. And, you know, maybe in our childhood, we were told to stop being so cocky, or, you know, don't be arrogant. The confidence and that arrogance kind of thing are so closely linked, aren't they? That sometimes it's difficult to distinguish between the two. How often do people look at people and go, wow, she's a lot, or he's a lot, or he's a bit full of himself, when actually what they're displaying is their own self-confidence. Whether it, I mean,
And
there's a whole conversation to have about whether that's real or not. That's another thing.
yeah, and I think a lot of that comes back to a fundamental question around judgment. So when people struggle for confidence, it's often that they are judging themselves first in an effort to avoid the judgment of others. And so that apprehension around, I don't want to be too much, I don't want to be one of the things that people I know in the past have experienced around me is finding me intimidating. And so my demeanor when I used to feel that would be to feel like I should shrink down or be different, or, you know, don't be intimidating, don't intimidate people. And one of the quotes that I heard that I absolutely loved was, I'm not intimidating, you're intimidated.
Yeah.
And for me, that really speaks to that aspect of, it's about somebody else's perception and we have the choice. And that doesn't mean that I won't display different behaviors in different circumstances and contexts, but I can be true to me and actually leave that judgment and not feel like, okay, maybe you do find me intimidating, and that's okay if I'm okay with myself. And so that comes back to my own trusting myself to be the judge about what behaviours do I display and what's appropriate and what's right for the situation and the context.
Yeah, and there's so much in that for me, particularly around we have a choice, right? About how we want to perceive others and about how we want to be perceived as well. And I think this piece around, you know, you're a lot, you're intimidating. There is a quote, isn't there, that's going around that says, yeah, I am a lot because I'm confident in myself. And yeah, I am. So, you know, if you want to work with me, or and we both know, right? We're both self-aware enough to know that we're not going to be right for everybody. So,
Absolutely not.
you know, and that's fine, because I don't want to work with everybody. There's another social quote that I really love that says something like, why are you trying to be liked by everybody because you don't like everybody? And how true is that?
Love it.
It's so true. And because we don't, you know, how often do you go, oh, I don't like that person. We do, whether we like it or not, we do it. It's human behaviour. So, yeah.
And I also think, though, the less, so when you practice being less judgmental of yourself, you also, as you gain self-compassion, you also gain compassion for others. Yes. So actually you do like more people, or you at least you understand why they're displaying the behaviours they are that you may not find likeable. So you can it goes back to when you've got kids, doesn't it? Of, you might, I still love you. I don't like the way you're behaving. I remember that was from a parenting manual in the 80s. I'm certain of it. But it's that element, I think, of the more compassionate we learn to be of ourselves, and the less we judge ourselves, the easier it is to let go of what we think about other people as well.
Yeah, that's really true. And I've been doing quite a bit of work on self-compassion. And I like the work of Dr. Kristen Neff as well. She does a lot of work in the space. And I think one of the things, and I can't remember whether this was her or whether it was Brené Brown, it could have been either, around the whole, nobody sets out to make a bad decision. And often we judge people by their decision making, the choices they've made, but actually nobody intentionally sets out to make a bad decision. And it's your judgment that determines whether it's a good or a bad decision. And you've got a choice with how you choose to see that. And this has come up in coaching actually quite a bit just lately, where I've said that to somebody and they've gone, oh yeah, you're absolutely right. I hadn't thought about it like that. And I've, in my own self-compassion, in some cases I've had to say, come on, girl, you didn't set out to make that decision. You're only human. You can't, you can't do all of the things. And I think that that's linked to confidence, because actually I think self-compassion is what I would call a confidence cousin, something that boosts that confidence to help you feel more courageous, more confident, to be less judgmental of yourself. It's all interlinked.
Absolutely.
It's all interlinked. So let's move on then and talk about the inner critic. So as a bit of a backstory, most people, if they've been following me or listening to me, know that I have an inner critic, and she's called Betty. And Betty loves to ask me, what if? She's quite loud, maybe when things are a bit quiet in my business, or something's gone maybe not to plan. I'll hear her going, well, what if this? What if you do this and this doesn't work? And I've learned ways to manage Betty. The reason she's called Betty is because A, she's not a part of me. If by naming her, she's over here somewhere. And B, she feels like a lovely old lady or aunt that I'm not going to be too mean to, but I can say, thanks, Betty, I've heard you, but I'm going to go and do this anyway. Now, whether that always works is a whole nother matter. So tell me how you would describe the inner critic.
So I think we're quite similar in terms of our kind of views around this. And for me, the inner critic is generally well-intentioned, but often misguided.
Yeah.
And so I also name mine, and that's part of, again, what I encourage clients to do. And mine is Colin, and he has the persona of a middle-aged, grey-suited health and safety consultant. Apologies to any middle-aged, grey-suited health and safety consultants out there. But in that sense of, his role is to keep me safe by pointing out each and every risk of anything that I might consider doing. Yeah. So he will tell me, worst case scenario, tell me better not to bother, don't worry about that, don't do that. It's very much belt, braces 3 times over. And for me, that's when I really notice, is those times where and it's interesting, because I think people often notice and get frustrated by their inner critic when they're loud, when they hear those what ifs, or they hear the, oh, don't get too big for your boots, why are you trying that? That will never work. All of those senses of negativity that we hear. But the times where he's in the driving seat for me is when I don't hear him. And what I realise is that actually he's almost just conditioned me to have that going on in the background and not even notice. And so I am not taking risks. I am not showing up. I'm not putting myself out there. I'm not trying new things, not because he's noisy, but because actually he doesn't need to be noisy, because he's quite happy with my lack of risk taking. So yeah, for me, it's interesting for people to notice when do you hear them, but also how might they be playing a part with the stories that they've created when you don't hear them.
Yeah, and that's fascinating, because what went through my mind was they keep you in your comfort zone, don't they? Or
Yep.
the risk is that that's what they do. But you're right, it almost becomes like a noise playing in the background. It's there all the time, but because it's there all the time, you don't notice it.
Yeah.
So yeah, this point around, actually, I know when I do hear it, but when I'm not hearing it, what is that telling me? And that's really key. And I really like that angle of looking at it. How do you then manage that? Because it would be easy to go along just knowing that actually he's there, and I'm just going to leave him. So how do you manage that?
So I think there's a couple of things that come into play with this. So for me, there is a conscious practice of, so one of the questions that I like to use for personal reflection is, where have I failed? And if not, why not? Because, and I pinch that from Sarah Blakely, the founder of Spanx.
Yeah.
I read some of her life story, and it was a question that her dad used to ask her regularly. And so when she started her business, she had that conditioning, which is so unusual from an early stage of her life, of the expectation being, if you haven't failed, you haven't tried hard enough. So you should be able to articulate where you've had failures. And that for me was such a challenging question. And very often when I reflect and ask myself that question, my answer is, I can't really pinpoint failures. And that for me is the sign that, okay, I have been in my comfort zone. I haven't done something that felt risky. I haven't done something that gave me butterflies. So if I've not felt that risk of failure and I haven't actually failed, then Colin's in the driving seat. And that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and isn't that an interesting question? Where have you failed? Because when I first started my business, I think I've said this before, but it's relevant to what we're talking about now. I almost had to reframe that word failure, because when you start your business, you have to say yes to lots of stuff because you don't know what works and what doesn't. And I had to reframe the word failure to kind of say, actually, you haven't failed. It just hasn't quite gone as you had hoped. Because some people, I think what I'm trying to say here is that actually that word failure might work for you. And I can see where that would, because I know you and I know your style. But for some people, that word failure might not. That might be they might go down a whole rabbit hole of, oh, I'm not, then we're in that I'm not good enough space.
So what I think is really interesting is, for it to work for me, there's actually a really crucial element. So the question I ask myself is, where have I failed? And for me, there's a real distinction between having failed, something I've done that hasn't worked out, and being a failure, which is an identity that I can assume or not.
Yeah.
And so I had to learn to uncouple failing, not getting the expected outcome, not getting the success I'd hoped for, does not make me a failure.
Yeah. And that's a really important distinction, isn't it? And this is why often I think, in relation to confidence as a whole umbrella thing, language is so important. It's so important, the things we tell ourselves about what we are and what happens. And you're right, being able to uncouple those two pieces, because they are very different, aren't they? Makes a massive difference to how you then view things. So yeah, maybe that's something I might have benefited from.
And I think as well with that, if you think about the things that you tell yourself when you lack confidence, when you don't have the confidence that you would like to have, often the language that we use towards ourselves is often at an identity level.
Yeah.
You're an idiot. You're not good enough. They're very binary, and they are assuming an identity of a failure, an idiot, a fool, all these things that we can tell ourselves. And so is it any wonder that we don't want to take a risk or try something that we don't feel confident for yet? when the potential consequence is that that's what I'm going to have to tell myself. That's the identity that I'm going to have to assume if it doesn't happen, if it doesn't work. So, and that's where then the self-compassion and the self-trust comes in as the kind of the building blocks that can create the bridge to allow yourself, because actually when not doing something well doesn't equate to a change in identity, then it's safer to do it.
Yeah, and also all of those things that you've just said about, I'm not good enough, I can't do this, all of those kind of things, they're the kind of things that our inner critic says to us, but they're never things we would say to anyone else. We
Nope.
just wouldn't, certainly not in the way we say it to ourselves. We might give them feedback and we might, sugarcoat that, or do whatever we do with feedback. But we would never say to someone else, well, you're an idiot or you're a failure. Unlikely. I mean, I guess people might have heard that in their past, but we wouldn't say that to a friend in the same way. So you've talked about Colin in terms of him almost being there, playing constantly in the background, and you hear him from a belt and braces perspective. What are you doing when he's at his loudest?
So I probably find that easiest to answer in terms of the sensations and the emotions, because when he is at his loudest, I'm often feeling insecure, uncertain, anxious, nervous, like lots of those negative emotions. That's what I experience when he is at his loudest. And it's because he is absolutely adamant. He believes he's right. He thinks that he knows best. Sorry. You actually don't, Colin. But so yeah, it's those are the things that I experience when he is at his loudest, and the risk then is not doing the thing, whatever. So it's normally he's at his loudest if I'm considering a course of action, or to take a workplace example, it's that moment, isn't it, where you're kind of like, am I seeing things really differently? And you don't want to be the one to speak up when you're kind of like, but there's this thing that feels really obvious to me. Am I just dumb? Have I got totally the wrong end of the stick? And so that would be an example of, that heart thudding in your chest of, do I want to make a fool of myself? But then actually, if I have got it right, what, so there's almost a sense of responsibility to speak up, or there certainly was for me, but also that kind of vague horror of what's this going to do? And again, it's about that identity. It's what's this going to do for my reputation? If people think I'm stupid, or they laugh at me, or I have got totally the wrong end of the stick, I'm going to feel awkward, uncomfortable, so yeah, it's all of those kind of feelings and emotions surrounding it when he's loud.
Back to the self-judgment thing again, isn't it? Yeah, and the feelings and emotions are really interesting, because I think there'll be people listening to this that probably worked with you and I back in the day, and they would probably have a perception that you would never feel like that, because I don't think that would have been something we would have seen.
And again, so I think this is also really interesting, because I remember when I started that role, I remember a few months in having my one-to-one with my boss as part of my probation review. And I remember saying to her that I was struggling for confidence. And she looked at me like, what? I was like, I don't think you lack confidence. But how people show up and their demeanour is very often very different to what's happening inside, and what is kind of going on under the surface. And so I remember having somebody on our podcast, and I messaged after I'd edited it to say, thank you so much. It was like, I can't wait to let this episode out into the wild. It's, you brought so much value, to a guest who, again, outwardly perceived impressions, I think generally, if you asked anybody, would be she would be the epitome of somebody with a lot of confidence. And her response was, oh, thanks, I've been second guessing every word I said ever since the conversation. And I think often people who outwardly seem confident don't get a lot of positive feedback, because people assume they know. People assume, I kind of assumed that she knew that she'd done a good job and I was saying thank you. It didn't occur to me that she might want or be appreciative of that reassurance of how I perceived that recording had gone. And so I think when people show up and appear confident, they often don't get the positive reinforcement that someone who doesn't appear as confident will often get more reassurance, because people around them are compassionate and kind of like, no, you're doing a great job, keep doing it. I can see the improvement. But if somebody already appears confident, then I think it's very easy for people around them to think they already know they're doing a good job. I don't need to give them that.
Just to make an assumption that, and you're probably similar to me, that we talk about this, don't fake it till you make it, because I don't subscribe to that, but I do subscribe to this act as if you are confident, which is kind of a little bit what you're talking about. But then you're right, where does one end and the other begin in terms of acting as if you're confident, but when you still need that reassurance or that boost of confidence to say, you did a great job, thank you? Because I think that this sometimes happens in coaching. So as a coach, we go into sessions quite vulnerable, right? Because we never know what the outcome's going to be of a question or an observation we make. But also sometimes I know that I might take things to supervision and go, that session just didn't feel quite right, and maybe Betty's been doing a little bit of this, and my supervisor will draw that out of me and go, but actually you don't know what your client is really thinking. And then I'll get a message from the client that'll go, that session was really useful, it was really great, you really hit on this, or we really hit on this spot, or we really got to that point. But you're sat thinking, actually, did I do all right in that session? Did I get it right for them? And I think that's, again, where your confidence is doing this, isn't it, in that? So all these different connotations of confidence that underpin every single thing we do.
Yeah, and it's really interesting hearing that description around coaching sessions, because one of the things, again, in my own practice that has shifted gradually over time, I started with a view of how coaches should be. And I think that having a perception of what you think something should be and a finite outcome can really impact confidence, because it just makes it so binary. As soon as you don't hit that bar that you've set for yourself, then automatically that equals failure. Yeah. And in my own coaching over time, one of the things I absolutely loved from when I was training was this view of hold the framework lightly, and don't be rigid. And one of the things that I know has shifted in my coaching over time is I have a lot more fun now with clients. The sessions are a lot more lighthearted. They're not as serious. And again, I think a lot of that has come from my own recognition that a successful session with a client doesn't necessarily mean a huge light bulb moment in the session. It can be something has just fundamentally kind of shifted a little bit. It can be that something that comes up next time, they realise that actually I handled that differently because of that conversation that we had. So there's all these different ripples that can come out that we have no way of knowing when that session is taking place.
And I'm totally on board with this whole hold the framework lightly, or actually don't hold the bloody framework at all, honestly. But somebody described this the other week. We were talking about, there was a few coaches in a room, a group of coaches that actually, with this group of coaches, I never feel any comparison. And I do a lot with a lot of coaches, but I think it's because of some of what you've just said. I think there's an element of, we go off to coach training and we're fed frameworks and this is how it should be and the grandfathers of coaching and all of that kind of stuff. I think coaching shifted. I think you work with what is right for your client, and that might not be a model or a framework. It might just be they need half an hour to rant at you because then they feel better and actually you've done it, yeah? But at the end of that rant, it would then be a case of, what do you want from me now? But this group of coaches, one of them in particular described it as, there's a lot of snobbery in coaching. And wow, that smacked me in the face. I was like, do you know what? I've been doing this for years and you've just like hit me around the face like a wet fish with that, because it's true, isn't it? It is. I think it is. And I think that you and I probably take it with a bit more fun. The sessions are more organic. And do you know what? If there is a model or a framework that might suit a client's situation for them to help see it a bit objectively or a bit differently, that's when I might use it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there definitely is snobbery in coaching, but also to pick up on that comparison piece, because again, that's a habit that often undermines confidence.
Totally.
And I think what people worry about is when they feel less than. So I'm comparing and I feel less than. And I'm just thinking of a particular client that I worked with over quite a long period. And what she then started to recognise in the time that we worked together was almost, I've gone from comparing myself and feeling like I'm coming up short to feeling like I'm kind of above where I feel I need to be, to realising that actually success is not comparing myself to anyone.
Exactly.
It's comparing myself to yesterday's me.
Yeah, stay in your own lane.
And I think that is so useful when people are struggling with confidence, because there's almost the pecking order feeling of, and again, that can be really useful for me, is if I notice that I'm feeling better than someone in any given context, that can be a really useful check-in to be kind of like, well, why are you feeling the need to compare? Why does what they're doing have any impact? And I think a lot of kind of education and corporate life can condition a lot of this into people, where they do feel, exams, the whole thing of exams, of grades and how you compare to other people and opportunities that might or might not come because of it. We learn from a young age to compare ourselves. So unlearning that in order to learn true grounded confidence is not an easy journey, but it's important.
Yeah, and again, for me, comparison is a confidence demon, right? It's something that impacts that. And there is another podcast actually on comparison that I did with Claire Henley, where we were in a space. So she's actually a mediator, but we were in a space where we were at networking, three of us in a group together. The person we were talking to asked her to go and speak at their networking event, but didn't ask me. And I wouldn't, by the way, I wouldn't have gone anyway. And I'm not just saying that I wouldn't, because it was a networking event that I wouldn't want to be at, not my style. And but that could have been a few years ago a real confidence demon for me, where I'd have gone into a spiral of, well, why did he ask Claire and not me? And that, I thought, so we had a whole conversation about that, because I thought that was really interesting. But yeah, it's funny, isn't it, how sometimes these things creep up and you think you've done a lot of work on it and then suddenly it's there again. And but I do love this whole hold the framework lightly, because I remember going to a coaches thing once where we were sharing models, and I just felt like it was a bit of a model off, a bit like, I'll see you this model and I'll raise you this model. And I was just like, oh, but some of them I'd not heard of. And that isn't because I don't take my coaching seriously. It's because it's not appropriate in that moment for my client. A lot of my clients will want to hear more about the Bettys and the Collins, and the Big Pants, than they will about, I can't even think of a framework now. You see, you put me on the spot, Jacqui Jagger, and I can't think of a framework.
Bro, cigar, Oscar.
Any of those. I just can't. I didn't want to use Bro, because then I went down the road of, but Grey's like really common. So all right, Betty, off you go. Thank you. I thought I'd shut her outside. So look, we could literally be, I say this to a lot of my clients, but you and I, we know we can talk, right? Tell me, or give me in summary then, how you think the inner critic impacts confidence in a shortish sentence.
So the inner critic, I think it comes back to that point that you made about the inner critic's job is to keep us in our comfort zone.
Yeah.
So if we're not growing, if we're not developing, then our confidence can't grow. We can't have true confidence if all we're doing is repeating what we already know we're capable of.
Yeah, so true. And then I thought I'd got a final question, but I've probably got two questions. The first question is, some people might say, my inner critic motivates me. What do you think? I know what I think. What do you think?
Yeah, this is really common. People are quite attached to the idea that the inner critic, we need to be hard on ourselves to motivate ourselves. And for me, there is a difference between setting a high expectation and having a high standard for yourself versus being someone who beats yourself up.
Yeah.
And again, a phrase that I came across that I can't remember, but may have been Brené Brown, was beating yourself up doesn't make you stronger. It just leaves you with bruises.
Yeah, so true. So true. And actually, there's a really good, I don't know if you've ever read, it's called Playing Big by Tara Moore.
One of my favourites.
Me too. I go back to it all the time. And she actually has two chapters, doesn't she? One on the inner critic and one on the inner mentor. And the two things are really different. So I think the work that I've done with Betty, she's definitely could be a bad Betty and a good Betty. And then I want to go bam on the end of that and create the song. But the good Betty, I hear a lot of the time, probably in situations where I do need to pull up my big pants and go, I can hear her going, come on, girl. Come on, girl. I can hear that. But sometimes it's outweighed by the what if this goes wrong. So the ways to manage that. So I guess I'm interested then in probably your top 3 tips for managing an inner critic.
So I think first of all, it reminds me of, whack-a-mole, those games where you get like the things that come up. So I think first of all, be nice to them.
Yes.
And that is hard advice because when they're not being nice to you, you don't feel like being nice to them. And so people will be frustrated with their inner critic. They will, stick their fingers in their ears and, want to put distance. But actually, the crucial bit with this is recognizing, and that's why I've created the persona that I have for Colin of, he has my best interests at heart. He's just misguided. Yeah. And that allows me to have compassion for what he's trying to do and to see the intent is to keep me safe, but the way that he goes about it can be really frustrating. Yeah. And so I think that for me is a really crucial element, is about having that willingness to engage with, seek to understand your inner critic, what's their intention, and not have the kind of whack-a-mole game where you're constantly trying to beat it down and it just pops up somewhere else. Yeah. So I think that would be tip 1, is to kind of engage and be nice. Yeah. Play nicely with your inner critic. A second one, which is kind of a weird tip sometimes, people find this kind of like, but I work with a modality called positive intelligence, and one of the exercises from that is to have a picture of yourself as a child. Mm-hmm. And when you notice that you are speaking to yourself in those ways of talking down, don't be ridiculous, that will never work. And I pull this with clients, actually. I'm thinking of a particular client. I'm going to send this to her when it comes out. But there's a client where I will be like, I'm going to pull the big guns out now. Would you say that to your kids?
Wow, yeah.
And that for parents, like if it's not good enough, if you would not say, so often the people that I'm working with want to raise kids who are ambitious, fearless, fully embodied. And yet for themselves, they're handling all of this conditioning that's kind of brought them to where they are. And so it's kind of recognizing that when you have a picture of yourself as a child, it's that same element of be kind, be compassionate. It's that reminder, if it's not good enough to say to your kids or someone else's kids or that version of you before you had all this conditioning that kind of got in the way, then don't be saying it. Yeah. So that, almost what you're hearing yourself say, take that out and speak to that image of a child. you notice how cruel and mean you're being to yourself. So that really can help build that self-compassion muscle.
And then that one down.
And then what would I say? When you've got I've got 17 other options for tip number 3. So I think the one that I'm going to go with is to remember that just because you've believed something for a long time doesn't make it true.
Yeah.
So be willing to challenge those long-held beliefs and recognise they may have served you at that time that they were created, but you don't have to carry all that baggage for your entire life. You can, recognise that something that you have believed to be true for a long time may not be.
Yeah. And I think for me, there's something about don't believe what your inner critic says, because they're not always right. Yeah. And I love the picture thing, because I had a picture in my mind of a picture of me, and I'm at my nan and granddad's house, and they had a bigger garden than we had, or it seemed like it was at the time. I don't even know if it was. And I'm like striding across the thing, and I look really confident and like I'm really in charge. And I often think about that photo and think, oh, look, what would the little Gail do, or what would the little Gail say? And but I like this idea of, would you say that to that little Gail that's striding across there? No, of course you wouldn't. So then, yeah, you're right. Why say it yourself? Definitely. Yeah. Thank you, Jacqui. Tell me, before we go, and we'll put this in the show notes, but where can people find you if they want to know more?
So you can either go to my website, which is practicalleadershipcoach.co.uk, or I hang out quite a lot on LinkedIn. So you can come and connect with me, send me DMs, chat to me about all things confidence and leadership over there.
Jacqui, thank you. I've loved chatting to you, as I always do, but this one's clearly a very public chat. So yeah, thank you. And thanks everybody for listening, and we will see you next time on the next episode.